Well, thank you so much, Terence, for this fantastic introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be here with you today. I'd like to take you on a journey of connecting the dots, the art and science of creating good luck. Before doing this, I'd love to get a feeling for who's in the room. Who of you considers yourself to be lucky? If you please raise your hand. Who of you considers yourself to be lucky? Wow, a very lucky room it is. All right, wonderful. Okay. Fantastic. Who's somewhat lucky? You know, sometimes yes, sometimes not. Yeah? Okay. I won't ask the unlucky ones, no worries. We won't put that on the spot. But wonderful to see. We'll talk a lot about this today, that those of you who consider yourselves to be lucky tend to be luckier in the future, not because of some kind of abracadabra type thing, but because of some of the practices we'll talk about today. Before doing this, I'll give you a bit of context. I was made in Germany in 1984. Probably, 9 months before that, but in 1984, I came into this world, and I used to be that kid who was thrown out of high school, had to repeat a year, probably held the unofficial world record of how many dustbins and trash cans you can knock over on your way to school when you're driving. And then one day, in 2002, I wasn't so lucky anymore, and I crashed into 4 parked cars, all cars completely destroyed, including my own. And I won't forget the policeman who came to the scene. And he was like, oh my God, he's still alive. And that idea that I was supposed to be dead, that stuck with me. And I asked myself all these weird questions, you know? If I would have died, who would have come to my funeral? Who would have actually cared? Was it all worth it? And I had mostly depressing answers at that point. So it took me on an intense search for meaning, trying to figure out what is life all about. I read an amazing book, highly recommended, Viktor Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning, which is all about how do we find meaning in crisis, especially for the times we live in, a wonderful book. But I started reading it, and I realized what gives me a lot of meaning is connecting ideas, connecting people, and those sparks that come from it. And so it took me on a journey as community builder, entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, and later into academia. And what I found fascinating on this journey, and especially in our research over the last decade, is that the most successful, purpose-driven, inspiring people, they seem to have something in common, which is that they intuitively cultivate serendipity. They intuitively see a little bit more in unexpected moments and then turn that into this unexpected good luck. They work really hard a lot of times to have more luck. And so I got fascinated by the question, is there a science-based framework for this? And so our research over the last 10 years has focused on developing this science-based research framework that I'll talk about today, and we'll dive into this now. But to make sure we're on the same page, a couple of examples of serendipity. If you have erratic hand movements like I do, you spill a lot of coffee. So imagine you're in a coffee shop and you spill coffee over someone, and that person looks at you slightly annoyedly, but you sense there might be something there. You don't know what it is, you just sense there might be something there. And now you have a couple of options, right? One option is you just say, I'm so sorry. You walk outside and you think, what could have happened had I spoken with that person? Or that unexpected idea in a meeting, right? Like you have it and then you don't bring it up and you think, what could have happened had I brought that up? Another option, of course, is to start that conversation and that person turns out to become the love of your life, your co-founder, your next business partner, you name it. The point is that our reaction to the unexpected moment, us making the accident meaningful, a lot of times creates that kind of serendipity. But as we'll talk about, we can also create more meaningful accidents, not necessarily by throwing coffee at people, but we'll talk about other practices that we can all use in our lives to create more of meaningful accidents in our life. Here's another example of serendipity. Any ideas what this might be? Anyone, any ideas? Washing machine, yeah, close. Any other bits? Oven? Deep fryer? Yeah? Freezer, yeah. I think we're coming very close. So this is a potato washing machine. And so a few years ago, a company in China, one of the largest white goods producers in the world, they produce washing machines, refrigerators, and so on. And they received calls from farmers. And the farmers told them, your crappy washing machine is always breaking down. Well, why is the washing machine breaking down? Well, we're trying to wash our potatoes in it, and it doesn't seem to work. So what would we usually do? We'd probably try to educate the customer, right? We'd probably say, well, this is a washing machine for clothes, so don't wash your potatoes in this washing machine. That's not part of our plan. They did the opposite. They said, you know what? That's unexpected, but there's probably a lot of farmers in China and in the world who have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And that's how the potato washing machine became one of their products. Any ideas what this might be here? Say it? Oh, yes. Usually I would now say it's a good sign if you don't know. Now I can't say that anymore. But so this is exactly a few years ago, a company or a couple of researchers did research with medication against the pain in the heart, angina, and they saw some unexpected movement in male participants' trousers. And so what would we usually do? We'll probably say, oh my God, that's embarrassing. Oh my God, like let's ignore this side effect, right? Or let's find a better way to cure angina without that kind of side effect happening. They did the opposite. They said, you know what? That's unexpected, but there's probably a lot of men in the world who might have a problem in that department, so why don't we develop a medication around this? And this is how Viagra, with the generic name sildenafil, became one of the best-selling products in that domain. The point is, what all of these things have in common, and hundreds of examples of serendipity that we studied, up to 50% of innovations, inventions, a lot of times how life-changing events happen, like finding the love of your life. It's not just an event that happens to us. It's not like blind luck that's just kind of like sitting there and falls into our lap, like being born into a nice family or stuff like that. It's active luck. It's smart luck that we create by our own actions, depending on how we react to unexpected moments. And so what our research has focused on is to say, serendipity is not an event, it's a process. It's always the same process when you look at these examples where there's some kind of serendipity trigger, right? So there's the coffee spilling, there's the farmers calling up and saying your product doesn't work, there's unexpected movement in male participants' trousers, those kind of things. But then we have to connect the dots. We have to do something with it. We have to imbue meaning in the accident and actually also have the tenacity to go through with it, right? It's not enough to just run into the potential love of our life. We still got to go on dates, right? It's not enough to just have the idea for Viagra. You still got to, get it through the cycle and actually develop the product. And so the beautiful thing is once we look at serendipity as a process, we can influence it. We can either create more potential serendipity triggers, and I'll talk about this when talking about the hook strategy. We can learn how to connect the dots better, and we also can, of course, build a muscle for that tenacity that is needed to really, have serendipity happen in our lives. I'll talk about later how we tend to miss serendipity all the time because we don't expect it to be there a lot of times. But so serendipity really is about creating meaningful accidents and making accidents meaningful as an active pursuit. Now, the reason I asked you earlier if you consider yourself to be lucky is that there's a lot of experiments with people where you try to show how can you actually create your own luck depending on the situation you're in, and where you can put people into exactly the same situation and one will experience more luck than the other. And so one of my favorites here is an experiment they did with people who consider themselves to be very lucky and people who consider themselves to be very unlucky, right? So people who say, bad things tend to happen to me, I'm always in accidents, and so on. And we probably all know people on this continuum from very lucky to very unlucky. And so they pick one of each, and they say, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, sit down, and then we'll have our interview, our conversation. What they don't tell them is that there's hidden cameras along the street and inside the coffee shop. There's a 5-pound note, so money, right in front of the coffee shop door. And inside the coffee shop, there's one empty seat next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the 5-pound note, picks it up, goes into the shop, orders a coffee, sits next to the businessman. They have a conversation, exchange business cards, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. We don't know that part. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the 5-pound note, so doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made a new friend, and, potentially an opportunity coming out of it. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And you might see that a lot with couples, right, who go to exactly the same dinner or exactly the same event, and one seems to be a little bit more luckier than the other during that event. And that's really what I'll talk about today a lot. What is the kind of mindset we need to have more of that luck happen? Of course, we all have different starting points, right? A lot of my research is in sub-Saharan Africa. If you're an entrepreneur in the Cape Flats in Cape Town, your base level of potential serendipity is much lower, right? Versus like a lot of us here who have networks and education, a starting point is very different. But what our research shows is that in most contexts around the world, it is possible to have a serendipity mindset, but at the same time, of course, we have to work on the structures that hold a lot of people back from having more of it because of power dynamics and so on. And that's a whole important issue as well. But today we'll focus on the mindset piece. And so how do we go about this? How do we study serendipity? And one of the things that I've been very excited about is these kind of experiments where you put people into the same situation and then you see how the outcomes are different when they encounter unexpected moments. Or we do a lot of qualitative research where you go into a setting and then you observe over time. Let's say you're here and you unexpectedly bump into someone. What happens over time? Do you turn that unexpected moment into a potential outcome, or do you just kind of leave it there and that's it? And so we try to study that in a lot of ways. And so what I want to focus on in the second part today is to really think about what are some of the practices that we can all use to have more of this smart luck in our life, this serendipity. And that's really based on the idea, right? We live in a world where the old world where we could plan for the next 10, 20 years, that's gone, right? Especially for entrepreneurs, like you've always known that, right? That you can't plan for so many years in advance because real life is usually not like the original plan. It's not a straight line, it's more like a squiggle. And the question becomes, how do we build a muscle so that this squiggle turns out to be in our favor? Now, what I've been, by the way, I'm sure in this room, right, I'm a big believer that most of the knowledge usually is in the room rather than in the head of the presenter. So if you have any cool practices, how you cultivate serendipity in your life, please by any means tweet it with the hashtag TNW serendipity, and then we'll try to get a conversation going, and then hopefully we'll aggregate the most exciting practices that most of you have in your own lives. But so what are some of these practices that could be of importance? One of my absolute favorites is the hook strategy. The hook strategy is all about the idea that you can use memorable talking points in almost every interaction with people. And someone who does that really good is Ollie Barrett, the founder of Startup Britain. If you would ask him this dreaded "what do you do" question, right, that you get at every conference, hopefully not here, but that you probably get at every other conference in the world, so what do you do? He wouldn't just say, I'm a technology entrepreneur, or I'm in education, or whatever it is. He would say something like, I'm a technology entrepreneur, recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks where you could be like, oh my God, such a coincidence, we're hosting piano sessions, you should stop by. Oh my God, such a coincidence, my sister is teaching on the philosophy of science, you should give a guest lecture. The point is, I'm a big fan of writing down what are a couple of key interests, some key curiosities in my life that I want to explore, and then how can I bring that as a side note into as many conversations as possible. And from the most unexpected of places, someone might say, oh my God, such a coincidence, my sister this, my brother this, whatever it is. Because we can't know the social capital of all the people that are here, but if we give them a couple of dots they can connect for us, they start connecting the dots in very rapid ways. I'm a big fan also of the idea that we can use crises as an inflection point. So a lot of times when we've studied a lot of, for example, CEOs of large companies. And when you sit down with them and talk about what really makes you successful, a lot of times their real success started with a real crisis. It started with, oh my God, with this company, I almost went bankrupt, but then we had to rethink the business model, and then we actually built the much more scalable product. Things like this where the crisis itself, then the question is, does the crisis define me? Or do I try to define the crisis as the starting point for what could be even more interesting than that? It's like, with a breakup. When someone breaks up with you in a relationship, it feels painful in the moment, right? But maybe that's what has had to be needed to then find the right person that you were really meant to be for. And so it's really that idea of how do we find these inflection points in life. And I'm a big fan of the project funeral in companies, where the idea is that a lot of times when something doesn't work in a company, when something went wrong, we try to hide it, right? We try to say, oh, I don't want to be the loser, the failure, who's responsible for this, which is a pity, because we learn most from the things that didn't work, right? And so the project funeral is about saying, how do we lay to rest those ideas that didn't work? But instead of celebrating failure or anything around that, we're celebrating the learning from what didn't work. And we're really celebrating this and enabling others to connect with each other. And so in this one example, it's a company that produces an amazing window glass. And the idea is that the light doesn't reflect. Amazing technology, but the project manager put it to rest in front of project managers from other divisions and said, look, we learned that the market was just not big enough for it. We learned this, and we learned a couple of more things. Someone in the audience goes like, hey, have you considered what this would mean for solar? Have you considered if you take that technology into a solar context, how much energy that might absorb? And that is how, serendipitously so, part of their solar division emerged that became a major revenue driver. And so the point here is that, in a way, we allow other people to connect the dots for each other if we allow them to share these kind of things. Of course, a lot of times it requires psychological safety. You don't want people to stab each other in the back when they share those kind of things. And so what helps a lot, of course, is to build a culture that is supportive. And that's a whole other conversation that we can have over a beer or over a wine. That's, of course, also a longer journey. So what are other kind of practices? I'm a big fan of the idea of developing some kind of North Star or key curiosity. Someone who has been doing this really well is Paul Polman, the former CEO of Unilever. He would always have this idea, I want to leverage whatever I work with to somehow help people help themselves. And so he started doing that as a priest, and then he realized, oh no, actually I can do that better in business. And so he went over there and did it there. MasterCard did it really interestingly. The CEO of MasterCard said, look, we used to be a financial transaction company, and now when people work for us, that's interesting, but maybe not as exciting. But if we now want to get 500 million people into the financial system who were previously unbanked, so if we kind of have inclusive growth, now we have a North Star that people get excited about. And now they can connect the dots to this. And what's fascinating about this is that Ajay Banga, who used to be the CEO of MasterCard, he would be very conscious about this idea that put the North Star out there, put the approximate strategy out there, but then say that you want new ideas to adjust the strategy as it changes, and that's not a threat to your authority. And that's the big change in leadership, away from this idea that if you have a strategy, you attack the leader if you don't exactly follow the strategy. Then you don't develop the potato washing machine, right? Because you say, no, our plan was that we need this clothes washing machine. But as soon as you say from the beginning, hey, here's our North Star, here's our approximate strategy, but we will adjust that based on unexpected new information, based on local communities, whoever it is, then it becomes a strength because people feel they can put things into the conversation. How can we do this? I'm a big fan of asking simple questions in weekly meetings, like what surprised you last week? When you ask that simple question, someone might say, well, it really surprised me that farmers are using our product differently than we thought. And then you might actually spot also mistakes much earlier if a product doesn't work and so on. And so it's really legitimizing the unexpected as a potential source of insight rather than only something that questions our authority, something that looks bad, right? And that's really at the core of this. And then a last practice that I want to share in a kind of semi-virtual world that we live in. Of course, a lot of times these water cooler moments have been taken away, right? These moments where you bump into the boss of your boss in the canteen, and then there's this exciting new opportunity coming or so. And so I've become a big fan of virtual coffee trials. So the idea that people across the organization sign up for a couple of times they're free, and then they get randomly matched across the organization, different levels of hierarchy, different types of the organization, and that helps you also overcome these silos, right? To say the developer doesn't talk with the engineer, doesn't talk with the creative, doesn't talk with the management team. I always love, by the way, also when you think about physical space design, what Steve Jobs did with Pixar. Who of you is familiar with Pixar? I think, yeah, probably quite a few, right? So it used to be one of the most creative, or it probably still is, one of the most creative companies in the world. And Steve Jobs, when he was the CEO, he wanted a new headquarters. And so he told the architects, get me a new headquarters. And so the architects said, okay, great, let's build 3 buildings, one for management, one for the creatives, and then one for the engineers. And he said, well, that's the worst idea I've ever heard in my life. Like, why do you want to separate exactly those people who never speak with each other, but who should speak with each other? And so he said, let's build one big building. Let's put the atrium in the middle, the coffee shop in the middle, so that they have to bump into each other. He also wanted to put the only toilet in the middle, but his board didn't like it, so they had a couple of more toilets then. But the point was, he tried to design for people to collide all the time, and so they put the mailboxes, for example, of the designer next to this management team member, next to the engineer, so that they would bump into each other, and then they might think, oh my God, this person isn't as big of a nerd as I thought, or that kind of stuff, right? Where it brings people together because they have to bump into each other. So there's a lot of things around space design that we can think about, how you nudge people to run into each other. Now, long story short, serendipity doesn't fall from the sky. A lot of times, people who have a lot of serendipity tend to work very hard for having that serendipity. And one of the kind of goals of this work is to say, how do we give an active language to something that always seems passive? But actually, no, these people created a culture that allows for serendipity to happen. And that's not questioning their leadership, but that's actually great leadership. The CEO of Cummins, which is a large Fortune 500 company, Tom Lindenbarger, he says it beautifully. To him, cultivating serendipity is the only way to lead during uncertainty. Because it's the only way to be truthful to your employees, to say, you know what, we don't know everything. I can't give you certainty, but I can give you clarity. And I think that kind of shift away from here's the exact timeline all the time to here's the timeline I'm giving you, but let's adjust this as new information coming in, that allows people to spot the unexpected and build it into that. Now, where does that leave us? A couple of final thoughts. One is that nobody likes change too much. Everyone's talking about innovation and change and everything, but then when it affects the actual person, you're like, yeah, well, but maybe not yet. Maybe we'll do it next year. And so the thing really is, what I found extremely useful is to reframe it away from what's the biggest risk if we innovate, if we change, to what's the biggest risk if we don't do it? What happens if we don't do it? It's the same, in this coffee shop situation. I used to have a fear of rejection. So when you have a fear of rejection, and it's probably still partly there, when you have a fear of rejection, you don't speak with the person, right? Because you think in worst case scenario, oh, if I speak with that person and they reject me, that feels really bad. So my worst case was always the rejection. But then at some point I realized, no, the worst case is not the sting of rejection. The worst case is this feeling when you walk outside and you think, what could have happened, right? The same with the speaker. When you could have spoken with this, Tim Berners-Lee, who was here yesterday, right? Amazing brain, like beautiful mind. And you wanted to go to him because you had that idea, but you didn't. You probably think longer about this than if you would just have said, I'm so sorry, I'm running to the cab, but let's talk another time, right? And so it's really kind of this reframing away from what's the worst thing that can happen if I do it, to what's the worst thing that I can do that happens if I don't do it. It's like, in a way, regret minimization. Another one is really around the idea of embracing imperfection. There's always this tendency to, let's be perfect and everything else. That's not the world we live in, of course, right? And those of you who are parents, as Terence mentioned, as a new father, I think this embracing imperfection is definitely something I'm trying to also practice a lot in that regard. But if you look at companies like Pixar, they would, start some meetings back when Ed Catmull was still very involved with, hey, at the beginning, all of our movies are bad. Now let's start the meeting. And so now, especially junior people get the license to also come up with these unexpected ideas that are not mature yet, that are not kind of so well formulated yet. And that's really something, right? To normalize this idea that, yes, we all want to avoid mistakes that can be avoided. We all want to kind of not have annoying mistakes that could be avoided. But we also want to have people be truthful about that life is not linear. Life is like more like a squiggle. And so the last point really is that a happy ending depends on when we stop the story, right? If we stop the story when someone just broke up with us, then we are the person who was broken up with. But if we continue and see it as an inflection point, then it might become, that moment might become actually the ending we were looking for. And of course, it's never a real ending, right? Then the next thing happens, and the next thing happens, and the next thing happens. But so the point being, we're all winging it at times, and that's I guess, how life is. I always enjoy that, when you sit down with people who are high-powered, and after the fourth glass of red wine, everyone's like, you know what? I had no idea what I was talking about today, but, people believed it, so, that's actually something with doctors, a good friend of mine who's a doctor, I asked her, why do doctors always go outside so often? Because I always assumed it would be because they have to double-check something or something. And she said she does it sometimes because she has to Google something. She just doesn't know what it could be, and so she's just Googling it. And so my point is, nobody knows everything, especially doctors, and so it's the kind of thing where, and that's okay. That's why we have Google and other things, right? So, long story short, the German in me would be remiss if I wouldn't end on a philosophical note. Goethe. So I grew up in Heidelberg, where Goethe and Schiller wrote a lot of their poems, and Goethe had this beautiful idea that if you take someone as they are, you make them worse. But if you take them as what they could be, you make them capable of becoming what they can be. And that's what serendipity is all about. Serendipity is about potentiality. It's about what could be. It's about seeing a little bit more in unexpected moments and then turning them into this kind of unexpected smart luck. And that's really, the reason I'm excited about this. I mean, imagine a world where the unexpected is not just the source of anxiety, of the things that kind of derail our plans, but of joy, of meaning, of the things that actually show us what could be possible. And I think then maybe we live in a world where we get a bit more out of the fight or flight into a world that is more excited about what's actually possible when we all work together. With this, we will have a book signing right after this over there. My editor tells me I should mention that, so I am mentioning it. For now, thank you so very much for joining, and I'm looking forward to keeping in touch. Thank you.